Every county keeps records: births, marriages, deaths, land transfers, tax books. They are supposed to be the bones of history, quiet proof that someone lived, that a family existed, that a life left a mark. But in one rural county in the American South, those bones are missing, not damaged, not misplaced, not destroyed by fire or flood. They are simply gone. Between the late 1840s and the end of the Civil War, more than 300 names vanish from the written record. Men, women, children, people who were born, asterisk who labored, who aged, who died, erased so thoroughly that only the gap they left behind remains, and the absence is not random. Every missing name leads back to the same property, the same stretch of land, an estate that still stands today, preserved, restored, and promoted as a historic landmark. Visitors walk its paths. Guides speak of architecture, agriculture, and heritage. But ask about the families who worked that land, who raised its walls, planted its fields, buried their dead in its soil, and the record goes silent. As if they never existed at all. This is the story of how an entire community was deliberately removed from history, and how much effort it took to keep them forgotten. The discovery did not begin as an investigation. In the early 1960s, a young historian returned to his childhood county to settle an inheritance. The house had belonged to an elderly relative, a former schoolteacher who had lived alone for decades, surrounded by books, letters, and carefully saved paper. She had raised him after his parents died young. The house was full of memory, summer visits, quiet evenings, stories told on the porch. It was also full of boxes. Every receipt, every letter, every bulletin and note. All kept. The historian spent days sorting through the rooms, setting aside what could be donated, preserving what mattered. The attic was last. Up a narrow staircase, beneath a single bare bulb, he found what he expected: stacked cartons, old magazines, a trunk that hadn't been opened in years, and then something he didn't expect: a leather case, cracked with age, heavy, hidden behind other belongings. Inside were documents. Not casual papers, but organized records, tied bundles, labeled folders, parchment mixed with yellowed sheets, the kind of material historians rarely find intact. One folder stopped him cold. It was marked as estate records. Private. Covering the years before and after the war. What he held was a primary source, the kind that usually doesn't survive. As he read, the picture emerged: inventories, correspondence, harvest tallies, repairs, purchases, and then, buried deep in the stack, a ledger page dated to the late 1840s. At the top was a heading: a quarterly accounting of labor. Below it, a list of names. Grouped into families, children listed beneath parents, ages recorded carefully, infants and elders included alike, dozens of people. And beside every single name, written later, in a different hand, was the same note. Removed. All at once. No destination, no explanation, no sale listed. Just removal. At first, the historian assumed the answer would be simple. Large estates failed, owners died, labor forces were sold, but sales left trails. Bills, receipts, transfers. This one didn't. Back in the city, he contacted archives, societies, clerks. He requested tax rolls, property records, anything that might explain where those families went. The response he received raised more questions than it answered. Some files were available, others, specifically those connected to the estate, were restricted, sealed, due to administrative complications. That alone made no sense. The property had already been designated historic years earlier. There were no boundary disputes, no lawsuits. Yet when he visited the courthouse in person, the answer didn't change. The clerk was polite, firm, unyielding. Those records were not open to review. If he wished to challenge the decision, he could file a formal request. He did, weeks later. The request was denied without explanation, so he stopped asking permission. Instead, he worked backward. He began with public records that could not be sealed, federal census data, tax assessments, church registries. What he found was impossible to ignore. In 1 decade, the estate listed a full labor force. In the next, it listed none. Then, suddenly, years later, the numbers reappeared, larger than before, but the ages didn't make sense. Children appeared who should have been adults. Adults appeared who hadn't aged properly. Entire family structures reset. It was as if a community had vanished and another had taken its place. That was when the historian realized the truth. This was not a sale. It was a substitution. And substitution requires a place where people can be held without public record, a place where names don't matter, a place where removal doesn't require explanation. The county had once supported several churches. By the middle of the 19th century, 3 congregations were active within a few miles of the estate. 2 of them lost their ledgers during the chaos of the war, fires, evacuations, hurried removals, but 1 church survived intact. Its records had been stored inside a reinforced vault beneath the sanctuary floor, protected from flame and weather alike. That is where the historian went next. The building was modest. White clapboard, narrow windows, a bell that had been rung for generations. The current minister welcomed academic visitors. Though he admitted they were rare, most people who came looking through old ledgers, he explained, were searching for family connections, names passed down but never confirmed. The records were kept carefully. Bound volumes, handwritten entries, ink faded but legible. The historian began with the decade that mattered most. What he found at first was ordinary. Baptisms recorded in careful script, marriages listed with dates and witnesses, burials noted with restrained solemnity, children born, couples joined, elders laid to rest. Life reduced 2 lines on a page. And then something changed. 1 entry stood out, not for what it described, but for its scale. A single Sunday. Dozens of names. Men, women, children, all baptized together, all listed under the same estate. The handwriting shifted, rushed and uneven, as if the clerk had been overwhelmed by the number of people standing before the altar at once. It read less like a ceremony and more like a preparation. After that day, the entries stopped. No more baptisms connected to the estate. No marriages, no deaths for nearly a decade. The property vanishes from the church record entirely. Then, years later, it returns, new names appear, different families, different lineages. None of the earlier names resurface. It is as if the congregation itself had been replaced. The historian sat with the book open, turning pages slowly, letting the implication settle. A minister noticed his expression and asked if something unusual had appeared. There was, the historian replied, and he asked whether any correspondence from that period had survived. Letters, notes, anything that might explain the gap. The minister hesitated, then excused himself. When he returned, he carried a thin folder. Inside were personal papers belonging to a previous pastor, mostly routine matters, sermon outlines, maintenance notes, lists of visiting clergy. Near the back was a letter. It was dated to the spring of the same year the baptism stopped, addressed to a senior church authority. The tone was restrained but urgent. The pastor wrote of families coming to him in distress, of relatives taken without explanation, of children separated from parents, of questions he could not answer. He wrote that when he attempted to raise concerns with the estate's owner, he was warned firmly that church inquiry into private matters would not be welcomed. He described being torn between his duty to his congregation and the expectations of local power. These people came seeking comfort, the letter read, and I fear I have failed them. There was no response attached. No follow up. No resolution. The letter ended, and so did the record. That night, The historian could not sleep. Families separated, a pastor silenced, an entire community vanishing from both civil and religious documentation. Whatever had happened had required cooperation or intimidation across multiple institutions, and that meant there would be a financial trace. Money always left paper. He widened his search: state archives, legislative journals, infrastructure budgets. Most returns yielded nothing new. Then, buried inside an otherwise routine government report, he found a brief appropriation, funding approved for expansion of a state medical facility. The institution had been founded only a few years earlier, praised as modern, humane, progressive. The expansion added new wings, and more importantly, farmland. The footnote mattered more than the headline. A private donor was listed, the same estate owner. The contribution was enormous for its time. Enough to build barns, fields, workshops. Official reports described the labor as therapeutic, patients engaged in productive work for their own benefit. The numbers climbed each year, dozens, then nearly 100. When the historian examined the breakdown by county of origin, his hands went cold. One rural county accounted for an impossible percentage of admissions. Far beyond statistical probability. This was not illness. It was intake. He sought confirmation from someone who understood institutional history. A colleague specializing in 19th century medicine listened carefully as he laid out the evidence. Then she explained the loophole. In that era, diagnoses were elastic. Certain conditions existed almost exclusively on paper, invented to explain behavior that challenged authority. Disobedience, refusal to labor, attempted escape, reframed as sickness. In theory, anyone labeled this way could be confined indefinitely. The cost usually prevented abuse, unless someone else was paying, unless confinement served another purpose. An institution, she explained, was the perfect place to make people disappear. No public access, no legal standing for those inside. Labor extracted without ownership, families erased by redefining them as patients, parents, children, even infants, entire lineages removed at once. The historian understood then. This was not cruelty born of impulse. It was a system, deliberate, documented, designed. And someone, somewhere, had signed the papers. The historian eventually went to the land itself. The estate still existed, not abandoned, not hidden, preserved. It was now operated as a public historic site, managed by a cultural organization devoted to education and tourism. Visitors arrived daily. They walked gravel paths, photographed columns, listened to carefully prepared stories. From a distance, the property was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate. A broad house sat above the riverbank, its pale facade reflected in slow-moving water. Ancient oaks framed the grounds, their branches heavy with moss that swayed even when the air was still. Everything looked timeless. Everything looked clean. The reconstructed living quarters stood nearby, rebuilt for interpretation. Guides explaining daily routines in gentle language that avoided discomfort. Labor was mentioned. Hardship softened. Violence implied, but never detailed. The historian joined a tour. When it ended, he asked to speak privately with the site's director. The man who met him was friendly and confident, deeply knowledgeable about architecture and restoration timelines. He spoke easily about preservation grants and visitor numbers. Serious academic inquiry, however, was not his usual terrain. The historian showed him copies of the ledger pages, dozens of names, entire families, all marked as removed in the same year. He asked a simple question: were there any estate records explaining what happened to these people? The director studied the pages, visibly surprised. He admitted he had never seen this ledger before. When asked where it came from, the historian explained its origin: a private attic, preserved unintentionally for decades. The director handed the pages back. He explained that most estate records from the period had been lost during the war. When pressed further, his tone changed slightly. There were complications. Descendants of the original ownership family, he said, had disputed the state's claim over certain historical materials. The matter had been tied up in legal review for years. Which descendants? The historian asked. That information, the director said carefully, was not something he could share. There it was again, the wall. The historian tried another route. He asked about burial grounds. There was a family cemetery. He was told, visible from the hill behind the house. Well maintained. Marked stones. Names carved deep into marble. But what about burials for the laborers? The director hesitated. There were unmarked graves, he admitted, toward the edge of the property, near where the fields had once stretched. They had never been excavated, out of respect. No one knew exactly how many were there. Perhaps 100. The historian asked to see them. The area was quiet. Pine trees grew close together. The ground dipped unevenly. Shallow depressions scattered across the clearing like impressions left by something heavy long. Removed. No stones. No markers. No names. Just earth. He counted slowly. The number was far lower than expected. Given how long the estate had operated, how many people had lived and worked there over decades, the number of visible graves was insufficient, to few, which meant some of the dead had been buried elsewhere, or not recorded at all. The weight of it pressed down on him, not chaos, not neglect, but intent, evidence removed not in haste, but in sequence. Before leaving, the historian asked one final question. When had the estate's owner died? The answer came quickly, a few years after the war. And was there a will? That, the director said, would be on file at the county courthouse. It was. The historian obtained a copy days later. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Property distributed to family, debts acknowledged, assets itemized. Then he reached a clause near the end. It instructed the executors to destroy all personal papers related to estate operations during a specific range of years. Not preserve them. Not donate them. Destroy them. Within a fixed period. Verified by affidavit. Attached was a sworn statement from a family member confirming that the documents had been burned according to instruction. The historian sat in the courthouse reading room, light slanting across the table, and finally saw the outline of the machine at work. People removed, records erased, proof eliminated, but motive was still missing. The missing piece arrived by chance, months later, while presenting preliminary findings at an academic conference. The historian mentioned the estate owner's name. Afterward, an elderly scholar approached him quietly. The name, he said, had appeared in another context, not agriculture, not property. Railroad construction, specifically. Labor contracts from the late 1840s. 2 weeks later, the historian was inside a corporate archive, reading brittle contracts bound in leather. And there it was. An agreement leasing dozens of able-bodied workers for infrastructure construction. The term was long, the payment substantial, and the language precise. The provider guaranteed that no legal claims would arise from the worker's status. No documentation required. No registration expected. The company accepted labor without names. Without records. Without questions. There was only one way that was possible. Those people were no longer recognized as property. They had been reclassified. Institutionalized. Patients. The historian understood then. Labor had not ended. It had been rerouted. Through medicine, through bureaucracy. Through silence. But one question remained when the contract expired. Where did the original families go? The records did not answer, which meant the truth lay somewhere even darker. By the mid-1850s, the pattern was unmistakable. The same individuals appeared again and again across different institutions, under different labels, but always in the same order. First, They were removed from the estate. Then they appeared inside medical registers. Years later, their names surfaced once more in penal records. They had not moved freely. They had been transferred. When the labor agreement expired, the people were no longer useful as patients. They were reclassified. Again, this time as offenders. The prison records confirmed it. Men and women sent directly from the institution into long-term confinement. Their offenses were vague: vagrancy, refusal to work, disruption of order, sentences measured in decades. Inside the prison system, labor did not stop. It intensified. The historian reviewed the discharge logs. Some names were marked deceased. Others were marked released in the same year the war ended and the law changed. Released. But to where? No census entries followed. No church records. No death notices. 14 people stepped out of confinement and vanished completely. That absence troubled him more than the documents ever had. Records could be altered, ledgers could be burned, but memory was harder to erase. Somewhere, someone had remembered. He placed a small notice in the local paper. Not accusatory. Not dramatic. Just a request. Anyone with knowledge of families connected to the estate during the middle of the century was asked to respond. The replies arrived slowly. Most led nowhere. Then, one letter changed everything. It was brief. Careful. Written by a woman in her 70s. She explained that her grandmother had spoken of a place near the river, a property whose name was never spoken plainly. She said that after the war, her family tried to claim what they were owed. And every time, they were told the same thing. There was no record they had ever existed. No births. No marriages. No proof. She wrote that before her grandmother died, she had been given a book. Inside were names. Names the courthouse could not erase. The historian called her that evening. Her voice was steady. She explained that her grandmother believed names were taken deliberately. If people could not prove they had lived on the land, they could not claim wages. They could not claim land. They could not claim justice. The book, she said, had belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman who had taught herself to write. She had recorded the names of people she did not want forgotten. When the historian heard one of those names, his breath caught. It matched a name from the institution's intake files. He asked if he could see the book. The house was modest and carefully kept. The book lay wrapped in cloth on a low table. When it was opened, the pages told a different history. Dozens of names. Families. Children listed beside parents. Some marked as gone. At the bottom, a sentence written later in darker ink. These lives were real. Let them be remembered. The historian photographed every page. This was not anecdote. This was counter-record. The woman explained what had happened to her ancestor after the war. She survived. She lived quietly. She never spoke of the missing years. She bore scars. She searched for others, writing letters, asking travelers, visiting churches. Most were never found. Some were scattered. Some never returned. All. The historian showed her the documents, the medical records. The contracts, the prison transfers. She listened without interruption. Then she spoke. They worked them twice, she said, once as property, once as criminals, with renewed urgency. The historian returned to the numbers. The institution's reports accounted for only part of the story. Dozens of people were unaccounted for. Mortality figures were aggregated. No names. But 1 year stood out. An outbreak. Dozens of deaths in a single season, confined to the agricultural quarters. The laborers. A single newspaper paragraph acknowledged it. No investigation. No follow-up. Administrative records revealed the final indignity. Those without family contact were buried on the institution's grounds. Unmarked. Anonymous. The historian requested access to the burial site. The cemetery was neglected, enclosed by rusted fencing. Rows of small stones marked some graves. Others had nothing at all. A section of ground lay sunken, long and uneven. A mass burial. No markers. No names. Just earth, standing there. The historian understood the final step of the system. Remove people, redefine them, work them. Bury them, erase the path back to where they came from. He spent months trying to access sealed county files. Every request was denied. Each denial came through the same office, a legal office that had remained in the same family for generations. When he traced the lineage, the reason became clear. The guardians of the records were descendants of those who had benefited from their destruction. The silence was inherited, but silence no longer meant safety. The historian now had enough. Private ledgers. Medical admissions, labor contracts, penal records, a handwritten book of names. He published his findings. The response was immediate. Newspapers took notice. Institutions issued statements. And quietly, without announcement, restricted records were reopened. Not out of guilt, out of inevitability. Access was granted quietly. No announcement, no apology, just a letter informing the historian that the previously restricted materials would now be available for review. When he opened the files, they confirmed everything he feared. Private correspondence showed coordination between the estate owner and the county physician. Discussions of certifications, *** classifications, and expedited commitments. Letters with corporate officials outlined labor terms, rates, and durations. There were payment ledgers. Large sums, regular transfers, and a separate accounting book, never intended for public eyes, detailing how the profits were used. Land acquisitions, construction expenses, improvements to the main house. The estate's grandeur had not been built on crops alone. It had been financed by people erased on paper and repurposed through institutions. But one folder stood apart. It was labeled simply returns. Inside was a list. Names. Dozens of them. Beside each was a destination. Some were sent back to the original property. Others were transferred to neighboring estates, and several were marked with a single word. Sold. No location recorded. These individuals had been confined as patients, stripped of legal identity, then treated as property again, transferred without record, because no one was meant to question whether they still existed. The historian understood the audacity of it. This was not exploitation hidden by ignorance. It was exploitation protected by complexity. That winter, he compiled everything. Every ledger, every admission note, every prison register, every handwritten name preserved outside official systems. He reconstructed as much as could be recovered. Some lives ended in the institution, some in prison. A few returned briefly before being sold away again. Others vanished beyond trace. He published a second paper, this time with names. He sent it to historical societies, churches, and community groups across the state. At first, there was silence. Then the letters began arriving. Families recognized names passed down in stories, ancestors long spoken of but never confirmed. Each response was a small restoration, a life returned to history, if not to justice. Still, the historian knew the record would never be complete. Too much had been burned, too much deliberately erased. Then, months later, a package arrived without warning. No return name, only a phrase written on the envelope. A friend of truth. Inside was a single page, brittle, torn from a private journal. The handwriting was confident, educated. The entry described the final resolution of a long-standing problem. The remaining workers, it said, had been dispersed to distant markets where inquiry was unlikely. Local records had been amended, church entries removed, medical files sanitized. The writer expressed relief, not innocence. Order, he claimed, had been preserved. Those deemed disruptive were gone, Replacement labor had already been acquired. Younger, compliant, unburdened. By memory. The signature was unmistakable. It was not remorse. It was justification. And in that justification, motive became clear. The people taken had not been random. They had been identified, targeted, removed because they represented the possibility of resistance, of collective action, of refusal, of escape. Erasure was not a side effect. It was the goal. The historian never learned who sent the page. He suspected it came from within the same families that had guarded the silence for generations. Someone tired of carrying it. Someone who decided that truth, however late, was better than burial. Years later, the work was published in full. It became required reading. Institutions responded. The historic site revised its narrative. A formal acknowledgement was issued to descendants. And on the edge of the property, near the unmarked ground, a monument was placed. Simple. Stone. Inscribed with the names that had survived. Not all were recovered, but enough. Enough to say they were real. Enough to say they lived. Enough to say they were not forgotten. At the dedication, an elderly woman stood quietly, holding a worn book close to her chest. She placed flowers at the base of the stone for her ancestor and for those whose names never made it back. The historian stood nearby, listening to the wind move through the trees. He thought about how erasure works, not just through chains or confinement, but through silence, paper, and time. And he thought about how fragile that silence really is. Because sometimes, all it takes is one ledger, one book of names, one person unwilling to let the record end. 300 lives. Not all recovered. But no longer lost.